When it comes to the history of rock and roll, two names stand out like shining stars: Elvis Presley and the Beatles. Elvis, often referred to as the king of rock and roll, rose to fame in the 1950s, setting the stage for the whole genre. The Beatles, on the other hand, came into the spotlight a bit later, in the early 1960s, and they were often seen as the band that defined a generation. You might think that these two music sensations operated in separate worlds, but the truth is, they had a deep mutual admiration and even influenced each other's work. Elvis Presley was already a big name by the time the Beatles began their musical journey, and he was one of their earliest influences. The Beatles, especially John Lennon, openly spoke about how Elvis's rock and roll style shaped their own musical interests. In fact, Paul McCartney once said that without Elvis, there would be no Beatles, emphasizing how impactful the king was on their early careers. Elvis also made his mark by popularizing rock and roll, which gave the Beatles a musical landscape to explore and transform. When the Beatles first visited the United States, they were asked about their musical influences, and they instantly mentioned Elvis Presley as a significant figure. The admiration wasn't just one-sided, as Elvis also took notice of the British invasion led by the Beatles and their growing fame. At first, Elvis was somewhat skeptical about the new wave of British rock bands, but he soon recognized the unique talent of the Beatles. It's worth mentioning that the two music icons actually met once, in a meeting set up by Elvis's manager, Colonel Tom Parker, in 1965. During that meeting, which took place at Elvis's home in Bel Air, they jammed together, talked about music, and formed a connection that both sides enjoyed. Elvis was particularly impressed with the Beatles' musicianship and even picked up a few stylistic cues from them. After the meeting, the Beatles left with a sense of satisfaction, knowing they had met their idol, while Elvis gained new respect for the young musicians. John Lennon noted that Elvis was the only person who could make them feel nervous because they admired him so much. It's also interesting that Elvis started to explore more diverse musical styles around the time he met the Beatles, including delving into the psychedelic sounds that the British band was popularizing. Many fans and music critics point out that songs like Tomorrow Is a Long Time and Guitar Man show a clear influence from the more experimental work of the Beatles. The Beatles also continued to honor Elvis in their music, with Paul McCartney writing the song Let It Be as a tribute to him. Additionally, George Harrison cited Elvis's guitarist, Scotty Moore, as one of his primary influences in developing his own guitar style. It wasn't just about the music, as Elvis and the Beatles also shared views on performance style, always putting on shows that captivated their audiences. They both understood the importance of stage presence, and this mutual understanding added another layer to their admiration for each other. The Beatles took note of how Elvis could command a stage, something they aspired to do in their live performances. Elvis, in turn, appreciated how the Beatles were innovative in their concerts, incorporating complex musical arrangements that were unusual for rock shows at the time. Even after the Beatles disbanded and the members embarked on their solo careers, the influence of Elvis remained. In later interviews, Elvis expressed admiration for songs like Imagine by John Lennon, acknowledging the impact the Beatles had on music and culture. Similarly, after Elvis's death in 1977, each member of the Beatles paid tribute to him in various ways, showing that the admiration was long-lasting. Paul McCartney, for example, acquired the rights to some of Elvis's songs, making sure that the legacy of the king of rock and roll was preserved. John Lennon often cited Elvis in interviews, saying that he was the one who truly understood how to be a rock and roll star. Ringo Starr also sang Elvis songs in his solo concerts, keeping the memory of the king alive for his fans. Both Elvis and the Beatles had a transformative impact on the music industry, setting records and milestones that are still talked about today. They both won multiple awards, sold millions of records, and achieved international fame, all while respecting each other's contributions to music. Even today, musicians from various genres point to Elvis and the Beatles as their key inspirations, showing that their legacies are still very much alive. Whether it's in rock, pop, or even hip-hop, you can hear traces of Elvis's rhythmic style and the Beatles' innovative melodies. For instance, contemporary artists like Ed Sheeran and Taylor Swift have mentioned how both Elvis and the Beatles helped shape their musical perspectives. Various documentaries, books, and interviews continue to explore the fascinating relationship between Elvis and the Beatles, feeding the curiosity of new generations. Biographers of both Elvis and the Beatles often devote chapters to discuss how this mutual admiration came to be and how it influenced their respective careers. Even after all these years, the meeting between Elvis and the Beatles in 1965 remains a monumental moment in music history. That single meeting symbolized a passing of the torch as the king of rock and roll welcomed the new kids on the block, who would go on to redefine music in their own way. Music scholars often point to this relationship as a perfect example of how artists can both compete and collaborate, pushing the boundaries of what's possible in music. This collaboration didn't end with that one meeting. Over the years, there were talks of possible collaborations, although they never materialized. Fans have often fantasized about what a joint album between Elvis and the Beatles would have sounded like, blending the King's soulful vocals with the band's innovative instrumentation. While we can only speculate about what could have been, the mutual respect and influence between Elvis and the Beatles remain an inspiring story of artistic camaraderie. Both Elvis and the Beatles faced their share of controversies and challenges, but their artistry always shone through, earning them timeless adoration from fans around the world. As we look back on the history of modern music, it's hard to find another example of two such influential acts who not only admired each other, but also helped shape each other's careers. Even today, their music is still played on radios, covered by new artists, and cherished by fans of all ages. The story of Elvis and the Beatles is a testament to the power of music to unite people, transcending geographical borders and generational gaps. When we listen to the classics like Jailhouse Rock by Elvis or Hey Jude by the Beatles, we are reminded of how these two acts changed the face of music forever. Their songs have become anthems of sorts, capturing the spirit and emotions of millions of people, all while being the product of artists who held each other in high regard. In the end, the legacy of Elvis Presley and the Beatles continues to thrive, fueled by a mutual admiration. Which Beatles song was the first to reach #1 on the US charts? I Want to Hold Your Hand. When did the Beatles split up? (1970). What is the name of the Beatles' debut studio album? Please Please Me. What year was the first Beatles concert in the USA? (1964). What was the last studio album released by the Beatles? Let It Be. Where is the Beatles Museum located? Liverpool. What was the name of the street where the Beatles formed? Penny Lane. What was the Beatles' first single? Love Me Do.